Sometimes the desert teaches us that loyalty runs deeper than blood, and miracles wear the dust of hard miles. In September of 1884, the people of Red Mesa Ranch witnessed something that would shake their understanding of what one determined soul could accomplish. 14 donkeys appeared on the morning horizon, moving together like they shared one heart, circling a weathered mountain man named Gideon Hale. These weren't wild animals. Each one carried the Red Mesa brand, stolen months before and given up as lost forever. Yet here stood Gideon, a man who lived alone in the high country, surrounded by creatures that refused to leave his side. How did he find what no one else could? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The New Mexico territory stretched vast and unforgiving under the September sun, a land where the earth itself seemed to breathe in shades of rust and amber. Red Mesa Ranch sat at the edge of civilization, where the flatlands gave way to the foothills that climbed toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It was honest country, the kind that demanded strength from those who worked it and offered little in return, except the satisfaction of another day survived. Elias Carter had built his ranch with his own hands 30 years prior, when he was still young enough to believe that hard work alone could guarantee prosperity. Now, at 63, his hair had gone silver and his back carried the permanent stoop of a man who'd spent decades wrestling with the land. He stood on the porch of the main house that morning, coffee cup in hand, watching the sky lighten from deep purple to pale gold. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes just before the heat arrives, when even the birds seem to hold their breath. Behind him, the screen door creaked open, and his daughter Sarah emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 32, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Life had not been easy on her either. She'd buried her mother at 16 and never had the chance to be young. Instead, she'd learned to manage ledgers, oversee ranch hands, and make decisions that would have broken lesser women. Her hands were calloused, her face sun-weathered, but there was a grace to her movements and a kindness in her eyes that hadn't been hardened by the years. "Coffee's fresh if you want more," she said. Settling into the chair beside him, Elias nodded but didn't move. "Been thinking about those donkeys again," Sarah sighed. They'd had this conversation a dozen times in the past 4 months. "Pa, they're gone. We did everything we could. 14 good animals," Elias said, his voice carrying the weight of more than just lost livestock. "That's near about $800 in today's market. Money we don't have to spare." The theft had happened in May, during the dark hours before dawn. Masked riders, 6 of them, according to the ranch hand, who'd been knocked unconscious trying to stop them. They'd cut the fence, rounded up every donkey in the corral, and vanished into the night like smoke. The donkeys had been meant for the mining operations up north, steady income that Elias had been counting on to see them through the lean season. Without that sale, the ranch was struggling. Bills piled up. Creditors sent letters. The territory was full of men eager to buy up failing ranches for pennies on the dollar. "We'll manage," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We always do." Down by the barn, the ranch hands were beginning their morning routines. There were 5 of them now, down from 8 before the robbery. Elias had been forced to let good men go, men with families who needed the work. It hurt him more than he liked to admit. Miguel Ortiz, the foreman, had been with the ranch for 20 years. He was directing the younger hands, Johnny Patterson and Sam Wheeler, in mucking out the stables. Their voices carried on the morning air, punctuated by the occasional whinny from the horses and the lowing of cattle in the distant pasture. Red Mesa Ranch ran 200 head of cattle, a modest operation by territory standards, but enough to provide a living when combined with the horse breeding and occasional donkey sales. The land itself was decent. Good water from the creek that ran through the property, enough grass to support the herd, and timber in the hills for building and repairs. But decent wasn't the same as prosperous, and prosperity was what they needed now. The town of Red Mesa sat 3 miles to the east, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. It boasted a general store run by the Miller family, a saloon owned by Dutch Henderson, a former riverboat gambler who'd found his way west after a disagreement in St. Louis, and a church where Brother Samuel preached every Sunday to whoever showed up. There was a smithy, a boarding house, and the sheriff's office, where Frank Morton kept what peace could be kept in a territory where law was often a matter of interpretation. It was a community like dozens of others scattered across the frontier, bound together by necessity and the shared understanding that survival required cooperation. When the Johnsons lost their barn to fire the previous winter, every able-bodied person in the area had shown up to help rebuild. When young Emma Patterson took ill with pneumonia, Sarah had sat by her bedside for 3 days straight, spooning broth and cooling her fever until the crisis passed. This was the fabric of frontier life, woven tight because it had to be. But there were tensions too. Marcus Webb owned the largest spread in the region, the Cross W Ranch, and he'd been expanding aggressively over the past 5 years. He was a man in his late 40s, handsome in a hard sort of way, with money that nobody quite knew the source of, and ambitions that made smaller ranchers nervous. He smiled easily and spoke with practiced charm, but his eyes were always calculating. More than one struggling ranch had been absorbed into his holdings, their owners accepting his offers out of desperation rather than desire. Elias had refused Webb's inquiries twice now. The second time, Webb's smile had grown thinner, his handshake firmer. "Times are changing, Elias," he'd said. "Man's got to know when to adapt or get left behind." Sarah remembered that conversation well. She'd been in the room, silent but listening, watching the way Webb's gaze had lingered on her a moment too long before he tipped his hat and left. There was something predatory about Marcus Webb, something that made her skin crawl, even as he spoke words of friendship and concern. "Sarah," her father said now, pulling her from her thoughts. "What do you make of that?" He was pointing toward the eastern horizon, where the road from town cut across the flatland. A cloud of dust was rising, moving slowly toward the ranch. It was too early for visitors and too deliberate to be wild animals. Sarah stood, shading her eyes against the rising sun. As the dust cleared, shapes emerged, animals moving in formation, and a single figure walking among them. "Pa," Sarah said quietly. "Are those—" "Can't be," Elias breathed, but his cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the porch boards. Miguel had seen it too. He dropped the pitchfork he'd been holding and climbed onto the corral fence for a better view. Johnny and Sam stopped their work, turning to look. Within moments, every person on the ranch was standing still, watching the impossible sight unfold before them. 14 donkeys, moving as one, circling a lone man who walked with the unhurried gait of someone who'd traveled far and wasn't in any particular rush to arrive. Even from a distance, there was something unnatural about the formation, the way the animals stayed perfectly positioned around the figure, the way they moved with singular purpose. "Get my rifle," Elias said, but his voice lacked urgency. He wasn't afraid. He was transfixed. Sarah ignored the request, stepping off the porch and walking toward the road. Something in her chest had tightened, a feeling she couldn't name. This wasn't danger approaching. This was something else entirely. The man came into focus as the distance closed. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskins worn soft from years of use. His hair was long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was weathered like the bark of an old tree, lined and browned by sun and wind. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, each step deliberate, his gaze forward. At his hip hung a knife in a worn sheath, the handle carved with initials G.H. Gideon Hale, the ghost of the peaks. Sarah had seen him only twice in her life, both times years ago when he'd come into town for supplies. He was a legend more than a man, a mountain trapper who lived somewhere in the high country, appearing once a year for powder, salt, and whiskey before vanishing back into the wilderness. People told stories about him in the saloon, each tale more fantastical than the last. Some said he could track a sparrow through a thunderstorm. Others claimed he'd lived with Apache bands and learned their ways. A few whispered that he'd been something else before, something he was trying to forget, but nobody really knew. Gideon Hale kept his secrets close and his interactions brief. Now here he was, walking toward Red Mesa Ranch with 14 donkeys surrounding him like a guard of honor. And Sarah Carter felt her world tilting in a way she couldn't quite understand. The morning sun caught the dust around them, creating halos of gold, and for just a moment, it looked less like a man and more like a vision, something out of time, something that shouldn't be possible, but was happening nonetheless. The donkeys each bore the brand. She could see it now even at this distance. The distinctive RC mark that Elias had designed himself burned into each animal's flank. These were their donkeys, their stolen animals, returned by a ghost. Gideon stopped at the edge of the property, the animals halting with him as if responding to an unspoken command. He looked at Sarah, then at the gathering crowd behind her, then back at Sarah. His eyes were grey, the color of winter clouds, and they held something old and tired and impossibly determined. "Figured these belonged to you," he said, his voice rough from disuse but steady. "They told me the way home." The silence that followed Gideon's words stretched long enough to feel heavy. Sarah found herself unable to look away from those grey eyes, feeling as though she were standing at the edge of something vast and incomprehensible. Behind her, she heard her father's boots on the porch steps, heard Miguel's sharp intake of breath, heard the whispered prayers of Sam Wheeler, who'd been raised to believe in signs and wonders. "Lord Almighty," Elias breathed as he came to stand beside his daughter. His hand trembled as he reached out, not quite touching the nearest donkey, as if afraid the animal might vanish like morning mist. "They're really yours," Gideon confirmed. He shifted his weight, and the movement sent a ripple through the circle of donkeys. They adjusted their positions automatically, maintaining that strange protective formation around him. "Found them about 6 weeks back. Took me this long to get them here in good condition." Miguel pushed through the gathering crowd of ranch hands, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. He moved slowly toward the animals, speaking softly in Spanish, the words gentle and coaxing. The donkey's ears swiveled toward him, recognizing a familiar voice, but they didn't break formation. When Miguel reached out to touch the closest one, a gray jenny named Rosita that he'd helped birth 4 years ago, the animal sidestepped, staying close to Gideon. "They won't leave you," Miguel observed, wonder coloring his voice. "No," Gideon agreed. "They won't." Elias circled the group slowly, checking each animal with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his life with livestock. Despite the journey they must have endured, the donkeys looked healthy, thin perhaps, but not malnourished. Their coats had been brushed recently, their hooves showed signs of careful tending. Whatever Gideon had been through to find them and bring them back, he treated them well. "The brand," Elias said, stopping in front of a large jack named Samson. His fingers traced the RC mark, still clear despite months of wear. "These are mine, no question about it." "But how? Where did you— Does it matter?" Gideon asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested the answer was yes. It mattered very much, but he had no intention of explaining. By now, word was spreading. Johnny Patterson had already saddled a horse and was riding hard toward town, no doubt eager to share the news of the miracle at Red Mesa Ranch. Within an hour, the curious and the skeptical would start arriving. Sarah could picture it already, the way Dutch Henderson would close his saloon and come to see for himself, the way Brother Samuel would interpret it as divine providence, the way the gossips would spin stories that grew taller with each telling. "Mr. Hale," Sarah said, finding her voice at last. "These animals were stolen 4 months ago. The men who took them left one of our hands unconscious and bleeding. We searched for weeks. The sheriff searched. Professional trackers from Santa Fe searched. Nobody found a trace of them." Gideon's gaze shifted to her, and she felt the weight of his attention, like a physical thing. "I'm not nobody." There was no arrogance in the statement, just fact delivered plain. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure if it was anger or something else entirely. "We're grateful," Elias said quickly, sensing the tension. "More grateful than words can express. These animals, they represent a significant investment. Their loss nearly ruined us. But you have to understand, people are going to have questions. The sheriff is going to have questions. Then he can ask them, Gideon said. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather cord from which hung a worn knife in its sheath. He unhooked it with practiced ease and held it out to Sarah. "Hold this for me." She took it automatically, surprised by the weight. The handle was smooth from years of use, and carved into it were the initials GH, the letters deep and precise. This was a tool that had been carried every day for a very long time, trusted and essential. For Gideon to hand it over felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "I'm not going anywhere," Gideon said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not yet, anyway. I'll answer questions. But right now, these animals need water and rest." Miguel nodded and gestured toward the corral. "See, of course. We have—" But when he tried to lead Rosita away, the Jenny balked, braying nervously and trying to circle back to Gideon. The other donkeys grew agitated, their ears flattening, their bodies tense. "They need you to come with them," Sarah said, understanding dawning. Gideon sighed, a sound that carried bone-deep weariness. "Seems that way." They moved as a group toward the corral, the strange procession drawing every eye. The donkeys stayed close to Gideon, their hooves raising small clouds of dust, their breathing creating a rhythm like distant drums. When they reached the water troughs, they drank deeply but didn't stray from his side. It was as if an invisible tether bound them to the mountain man, something forged through shared hardship that transcended normal animal behavior. Johnny returned from town with Sheriff Frank Morton riding beside him, along with a dozen townspeople who dropped everything to witness the spectacle. Morton was a solid man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned that jumping to conclusions usually ended badly. He dismounted slowly, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Gideon Hale," he said, and there was history in the way he spoke the name. "Been a long time." "Frank," Gideon acknowledged. "These the Carter donkeys?" "They are. Want to tell me where you found them?" Gideon was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on Samson's neck. The big Jack leaned into the touch, eyes half closed. "Canyon country." 3 days north into the high desert. They were penned in a box canyon, near dead from thirst. No sign of whoever put them there, just abandoned. Morton's skepticism was evident, that's what I said. "And you just happened to be passing through this particular canyon." "I passed through a lot of country." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Gideon, you're asking me to believe that professional thieves stole 14 valuable animals, transported them 3 days into some of the harshest territory in New Mexico, penned them in a canyon, and then just left them to die. No tracks leading away, no indication of where they went." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Gideon replied, his voice still calm. "I'm telling you what I found." Dutch Henderson had pushed to the front of the crowd, his saloon keeper's instinct for drama fully engaged. "Maybe he's one of them," he called out. "Maybe this is how they planned it. Steal the animals, hide them, then have one man play hero and collect a reward." Murmurs rippled through the gathered townspeople. Sarah saw the calculation in their eyes, the way suspicion was beginning to take root. It was the frontier way. Trust was earned slowly and lost quickly, and a man who lived outside society was always viewed with a mix of respect and wariness. "There's no reward posted," Elias said firmly, "and these animals are clearly well cared for. If Mr. Hale meant us harm, he wouldn't have brought them back at all. Unless there's something else he's after." Marcus Webb's voice cut through the crowd. He emerged from the gathered onlookers, impeccably dressed as always, his expression one of concerned neighborliness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Forgive me, Elias, but we have to consider all possibilities. A man appears from nowhere with stolen property, refuses to explain how he acquired it, and expects us to simply accept his word." "I don't expect anything," Gideon said, and now there was an edge to his voice, the first crack in his calm demeanor. "I found animals suffering and I helped them. That's all, is it?" Webb stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder. "Because it seems to me that a man who can track what professional hunters couldn't who can survive in Apache territory without being seen, who can tame wild animals to follow him like trained dogs. That's a man with uncommon skills. Skills that might be useful in all sorts of endeavors, legal and otherwise. The implication hung in the air, ugly and pointed. Sarah felt her anger rising, hot and defensive in a way that surprised her. She'd known Gideon Hale for all of 30 minutes, and yet something in her rebelled against the casual cruelty of Webb's insinuation. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "This man has done us a service. He's returned property that we'd given up as lost. The least we can do is show him basic courtesy and gratitude." Webb turned his calculating gaze on her, and his smile was all politeness with nothing behind it. "Of course, Miss Carter. I meant no offense. I'm simply concerned for the safety of our community." "Your concern is noted," Elias said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. He turned to Morton. "Frank, I vouch for these animals. They're mine, no question. As for Mr. Hale's story, it may be sparse on details, but I see no evidence of wrongdoing. Do you intend to arrest him?" The sheriff studied Gideon for a long moment, weighing options. Finally, he shook his head. "No evidence of a crime. But I'll need you to stay in the area, Gideon. At least until we can investigate further." "I'll be at the ranch," Gideon said. "For now." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with speculation and wonder, Sarah noticed Brother Samuel making his way toward Gideon. The preacher was a small man, with kind eyes, and the gentle persistence of someone who believed his faith could move mountains. "Son," he said, laying a hand on Gideon's shoulder, "what you've done here, bringing these creatures home safe, that's the Lord's work. Perhaps he led you to them. Perhaps this is part of his greater plan." Gideon's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. "If God's got a plan," he said quietly, "he's got a funny way of showing it." Brother Samuel didn't take offense. He simply nodded, squeezed Gideon's shoulder once more, and walked away, leaving the mountain man standing alone in the center of a circle of donkeys who refused to leave his side. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning coolness. The extraordinary was becoming ordinary, as it always did on the frontier, where survival required accepting the impossible as merely improbable. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that Gideon Hale's arrival with 14 loyal donkeys was the beginning of something rather than the end. She looked down at the knife still in her hand, felt the weight of it, the trust implied in its temporary keeping. When she looked up, she found Gideon watching her with those grey eyes that seemed to see too much. "Thank you," she said, not sure if she meant for returning the donkeys or for something else entirely. Gideon nodded once, then turned his attention back to the animals that had adopted him as their own. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the real mystery wasn't how he'd found them, it was why they'd chosen him. Morning came with the smell of rain on the wind, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. Gideon woke to find Samson standing guard over him, the big jack's ears swiveling to track sounds in the pre-dawn darkness. The other donkeys were restless too, pacing their corral with an agitation that set Gideon's instincts on edge. He'd learned long ago to trust animal behavior. They sensed things humans missed, changes in air pressure, vibrations in the earth, the approach of predators both four-legged and two. Whatever had the donkeys unsettled wasn't good. He was checking the perimeter when Miguel found him, the older man moving with the quiet competence of someone who'd worked ranches his entire life. "You feel it too?" Miguel asked in Spanish. "Something's wrong," Gideon replied in the same language, appreciating the foreman's directness. "Has been since yesterday. See, the cattle are nervous. The horses too." Miguel squinted toward the eastern horizon, where the sun was just beginning to paint the sky pale gold. "In my grandmother's village, we would say the land is trying to warn us. Your grandmother was a wise woman." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, before Miguel spoke again. "Miss Sarah, she spoke with you last night, alone." It wasn't quite a question, but Gideon heard the protective note in it. "She brought me dinner. We talked. That's all? That's all," Miguel repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't quite believe it but was willing to accept the answer. She's a good woman, strong like her mother, but she's been alone too long, carrying too much. It makes a person, how do you say, vulnerable to kindness. I'm not—" Gideon started, then stopped. What was he trying to deny? That he felt drawn to Sarah Carter? That their conversation had stirred something in him he'd thought long dead? "I'm leaving soon. Back to the mountains. Whatever you're worried about, it won't have time to become a problem." Miguel's expression suggested he doubted that very much, but he simply shrugged. "The heart keeps its own schedule, amigo. Not always convenient, but always true." He gestured toward the main house. "Senor Carter wants to speak with you." In his office. Elias's office was a small room off the main house, its walls lined with ledgers and maps, its desk covered with the administrative burden of running a ranch. The older man looked tired, Sarah's practical concern for details evident in the neat stacks of paper, the carefully maintained records. But there were also darker signs, past due notices, letters from creditors, the math that didn't quite add up no matter how many times you worked it. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to a chair. "Coffee?" "Thank you." Elias poured 2 cups from a pot that had been sitting too long on the stove, producing something more suited to stripping paint than drinking. But both men drank without complaint, recognizing the ritual for what it was, a prelude to difficult conversation. "I want to show you something," Elias said, pulling out a broken spur from his desk drawer. It was well made, silver inlay work, marking it as expensive, custom. But one of the rowels was bent, and there were scratches that spoke of hard use. Miguel found this near where the fence was cut. The night of the robbery. Gideon took the spur, turning it in his hands. The craftsmanship was distinctive, the kind of work done by only a few smiths in the territory. And there, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a maker's mark he recognized. "Martinez, out of Santa Fe," Gideon said. "He only makes them for wealthy clients. Custom orders, that's what I thought. So I did some asking around. Turns out Marcus Webb ordered 3 pairs of these spurs about 6 months ago. 1 pair for himself, 2 as gifts for his top hands." The implication hung heavy in the air. Gideon set the spur down carefully. "This doesn't prove Webb was involved in the robbery." "No, but it's suggestive as hell." Elias leaned back, his chair creaking. "Webb's been circling my ranch like a vulture for 2 years. Made 3 offers to buy me out, each one lower than the last. After the donkey theft, he showed up with a 4th offer. Said it was a mercy, given my financial troubles." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "Mercy? From a man who probably orchestrated those troubles in the first place. You have proof." "Just this spur and a gut feeling. Not enough for the sheriff, not enough for the territorial courts. Men like Webb, they're smart. They keep their hands clean while others do the dirty work." Gideon thought about Webb's performance yesterday, the calculated concern, the careful insinuations. It had all been theater, a way to control the narrative, to make himself seem like the reasonable party while casting doubt on Gideon. "Classic misdirection. Why are you telling me this?" Gideon asked. Elias met his eyes directly. "Because you found those donkeys when nobody else could. Because you tracked men who were careful enough not to leave tracks for professional hunters. Because you're clearly more than just a mountain trapper, no matter what story you tell." He paused. "And because I think you're a man who recognizes injustice when he sees it. I'm not a lawman anymore." "Anymore," Elias repeated, seizing on the word. "But you were. I can see it in how you move, how you think. What happened, Gideon? Why'd you leave?" The question hit harder than Gideon expected. He found himself looking at the coffee cup in his hands, seeing instead the marshal's badge he'd turned in 15 years ago, feeling the weight of all the reasons he'd walked away from law and civilization. "I lost my family," he said quietly. "Wife and son, while I was away on a case, tracking a murderer through the mountains. They got my man, closed the case, came home to find them dead and buried. And I realized that all my skill, all my training, all my dedication to justice, none of it protected the people who mattered most. So I turned in my badge and never looked back. Until yesterday, I didn't bring those donkeys back because of some sense of justice. I brought them back because they were suffering and I couldn't walk away from that. And now that you know Webb's probably behind the theft, now that you see he's trying to destroy my ranch, my livelihood, everything I've built." Elias leaned forward, his voice intense. "Can you walk away from that?" Before Gideon could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Pa, Sheriff Morton's here, and he's brought someone with him." They emerged to find Morton on the porch, with a man Gideon didn't recognize, tall, thin, with the pinched look of a banker or lawyer. He carried a leather satchel and wore clothes that had never seen a day's hard work. "Elias," Morton said, his discomfort obvious. "This is Walter Griggs, territorial land agent. He's got some questions about your property boundaries." Griggs smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter, I've been reviewing the territorial survey records, and there appear to be some discrepancies regarding your eastern boundary line, specifically the area where your water rights originate." Elias went pale. "That boundary's been established for 30 years. "Yes, well, there's some question about the original survey markers. They may have been placed incorrectly." Griggs pulled documents from his satchel. "I have orders to conduct a new survey. If it turns out your eastern acreage is actually outside your legal boundary, well, that land would revert to territorial control and be available for claim." "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice sharp with anger. "Those markers have never been questioned before." "Times change, Miss Carter. The territory is becoming more civilized. We need to ensure all property lines are legally sound." Griggs's smile widened. "I'm sure it's just a formality." "Nothing to worry about." But Gideon recognized the play for what it was. The water rights Griggs mentioned. That was the lifeblood of the ranch. Without access to the creek, the property would be worthless, unable to sustain cattle or crops. And if the survey discovered that the creek was actually on disputed land, who ordered this survey? Gideon asked, his voice cutting through the tension. Griggs turned to him, his expression cooling. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Answer the question. The request came through proper territorial channels. The petitioner wishes to remain anonymous, as is their right." "Let me guess," Elias said bitterly. "Someone with a vested interest in seeing my ranch fail. Someone who'd benefit from my land being declared disputed." Griggs didn't confirm or deny it, but his silence was answer enough. He turned to Morton. "Sheriff, I'll need access to the eastern boundary to conduct my survey." "Starting tomorrow?" "Fine," Morton said, though his jaw was tight. "But you go nowhere on this property without me present." "Understood?" After Griggs and the sheriff left, the three of them stood in heavy silence. Sarah's hands were clenched into fists, her face flushed with anger. Elias looked older than he had just minutes before, as if the weight of the threat had physically aged him. "They're not even pretending anymore," Sarah said. "This is Webb, it has to be." "Probably," Elias agreed. "But we can't prove it. And even if we could, what good would it do? He's got lawyers, money, connections to the territorial governor. We've got a broken spur and suspicions." Gideon moved to the porch railing, looking out at the land, the rolling pastures, the distant mountains, the creek that sparkled in the morning sun. He thought about the life Elias and Sarah had built here, the honest work they'd put into every acre. And he thought about men like Webb, who took rather than built, who destroyed for profit and called it business. He'd walked away from this fight 15 years ago, told himself that justice was a losing game, that caring about right and wrong only led to pain. But standing here, seeing the fear and anger on Sarah's face, feeling the weight of Elias's desperation, he realized he'd been lying to himself. You couldn't outrun justice any more than you could outrun grief. Both followed you into the mountains and waited for you to come back down. "I need to see where you found those donkeys," Elias said suddenly. "The exact location. There might be something there, some evidence that connects Webb to the theft." "It's 3 days hard riding through dangerous country," Gideon warned. "Then we leave at first light." "Pa, you're back," Sarah started. "My back's been hurting for 20 years. I can stand 3 more days." Elias's voice was firm, final. "This is my ranch, my fight. I won't sit here and watch it be stolen without even trying to stop it." Gideon looked at the older man, at the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw, and recognized something he'd once seen in a mirror. A man pushed to his limit, ready to fight even when the odds were impossible. "All right," Gideon said. "We leave at dawn. But we do it my way, and you follow my lead. That country will kill you if you're not careful." "Agreed." Sarah stepped forward. "I'm coming too." "Absolutely not," Elias and Gideon said in unison. "It's not safe," Gideon added. Sarah's eyes flashed. "Neither is staying here while men like Webb circle closer. Neither is watching my father ride off into danger without anyone to watch his back. Neither is living the rest of my life wondering if I could have made a difference, but was too afraid to try." She crossed her arms. "I can ride, I can shoot, and I can handle myself in the wilderness. You need me, whether you want to admit it or not." Gideon wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to convince her to stay safe at the ranch. But looking at her, at the fire in her eyes, the determined set of her shoulders, he realized it would be pointless. Sarah Carter was coming, and nothing short of tying her up would stop her. "Fine," he said, "but you follow orders. No arguments, no hesitation. Lives may depend on it." "Understood." As Sarah went to prepare supplies and Elias retreated to inform Miguel of their plans, Gideon stood alone on the porch, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over his shoulders like an old familiar coat. He'd tried to leave this life behind, tried to forget what it felt like to stand for something, to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, but the mountains hadn't taught him to hide. They'd taught him to survive. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember the difference. The preparations took most of the day. Gideon moved through the tasks with practiced efficiency, checking saddles, distributing supplies, ensuring weapons were clean and ammunition was plentiful. Sarah watched him work, noting the care he took with every detail, the way he tested each piece of equipment as if their lives might depend on it, which she supposed they might. Miguel pulled her aside as she was packing bedrolls. "Are you certain about this, Mija? The country Gideon describes, it's not for the faint of heart." "I'm not faint of heart," Sarah replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she tied off the canvas bundle. "No, but you are—" Miguel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You are important to many people." "To your father." "To this ranch. If something were to happen to you out there, then something happens. But I won't let Pa face this alone. And I won't sit here safe while the men I care about risk their lives for our home." She met Miguel's eyes directly. "Would you? If it were your family, your land?" Miguel sighed, acknowledging defeat. "No, I would do exactly as you're doing. Which is why I'm sending Juan with you. Extra eyes, extra gun. He knows the country somewhat, and he's steady in a crisis." Juan Delgado was the youngest of the ranch hands, barely 22, but he'd grown up on the frontier and knew how to handle himself. When Miguel told him about the journey, he'd accepted without hesitation, his dark eyes serious with understanding of what he was being asked to do. By late afternoon, they were as ready as they could be. 4 horses, 4 riders, enough supplies for a week, though they hoped to be back in 5 days. Gideon had insisted on traveling light and fast, reasoning that speed would be their best defense against whatever dangers the territory held. Sarah was checking her rifle when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Brother Samuel approaching, his weathered Bible clutched in his hands. "I heard about your journey," he said. "Came to offer a blessing if you'll have it." Sarah wasn't particularly religious. Her mother's death had complicated her relationship with God, but she appreciated the gesture. "Thank you, Brother Samuel. I think we can use all the help we can get." The preacher placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The Lord protects those who walk in righteous purpose, child. What you're doing, standing up to those who would steal and destroy, that's the work of the faithful. Don't doubt it. I'm not sure righteousness has much to do with it," Sarah admitted. "I'm just trying to save my home, and that's righteous enough." Brother Samuel smiled. "But be careful out there. The desert tests us in ways we don't expect. Sometimes it shows us who we really are, and that can be harder to face than any physical danger." After he left, Sarah found Gideon by the horses. He was running his hands along each animal's legs, checking for any signs of strain or injury that might cause problems on the trail. The silver locket he'd shown her hung outside his shirt, glinting in the late afternoon sun. He'd taken her advice, she realized, and something about that made her chest tighten. "You ready for this?" he asked without looking up. "I grew up in this territory. I've ridden through desert and mountains my whole life. That's not what I asked." Now he did look at her, those gray eyes seeing too much. "I asked if you're ready, because once we leave, there's no turning back. If Webb is behind this, if he's got men watching, we're going to be vulnerable out there. And there are things in that country that don't care about good intentions or brave hearts." Sarah thought about all the reasons she should stay, the ranch that needed her, the safety of familiar walls, the comfortable lie that someone else could fix this. Then she thought about her father's face this morning, the way defeat had started to settle into his features. She thought about the years of work they'd put into this land, the dreams buried here alongside her mother. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Are you?" Gideon's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I stopped being ready for anything about 15 years ago. But I'm going anyway." That's the spirit. They rode out at dawn, 4 figures moving into the sunrise like pieces on a vast chessboard. The morning was cool, the air carrying that crystalline quality it only held in high desert country. Behind them, Miguel and the remaining hands stood watching until the riders disappeared into the landscape's folds and shadows. The first day passed without incident. Gideon led them northeast, away from the established trails, following paths only someone with extensive knowledge of the territory would know. They crossed dry washes and skirted around patches of alkali flat that could trap a horse, riding in silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the sound of hooves on stone. Elias rode with the stiffness of a man whose body was protesting every movement, but he didn't complain. Juan kept watch on their back trail, his hand never far from the rifle across his saddle. And Sarah found herself studying Gideon, watching the way he read the land, noting things she couldn't see, interpreting signs written in dust and displaced stones. They made camp that evening in a small canyon, sheltered from the wind and hidden from casual observation. Gideon had chosen the spot with care, Sarah noticed. Good sight lines, multiple escape routes, a defensive position if it came to that. He was thinking like a lawman again, or maybe like a soldier, planning for trouble even while hoping it wouldn't come. After a cold dinner, Gideon forbade fire. Not wanting to advertise their position, Sarah found herself sitting near him as the others settled in for sleep. The stars overhead were brilliant in the way they only were far from civilization. So numerous, they seemed to blend together into rivers of light. "You miss it," Sarah said quietly. "The law work. Being part of something larger than yourself." Gideon didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "I miss the clarity of it. The way the world seemed simpler, right and wrong, justice and crime. But that clarity was an illusion. The real world is messier. Good people do bad things for understandable reasons. Bad people hide behind law and respectability. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, justice is just another word for failure arriving too late. That's a bleak view. It's an honest one." He glanced at her. "Why do you care what I miss or don't miss?" Sarah considered the question, surprised to find she didn't have a simple answer. "Because I think you're lying to yourself. You say you chose the mountains, but I think the mountains chose you. Gave you a place to hide when the world became too painful to face. And now you're back in that world, whether you wanted to be or not, and part of you, maybe a small part, but still, part of you is relieved. You think you have me figured out. I think we're not so different, you and I. Both of us hiding in our own ways. Both of us carrying grief that shapes everything we do. The difference is I'm ready to stop hiding. Question is, are you?" Gideon turned his full attention to her then, and Sarah felt the intensity of his focus like a physical weight. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, two people shaped by loss, trying to decide if they were brave enough to hope for something more than survival. "Your father's right to be concerned about you," Gideon said finally. "Why's that?" Because you're the kind of woman who makes a man want to be better than he is. And that's dangerous for everyone involved. Before Sarah could respond, Juan's low whistle cut through the night, a warning signal. Instantly, Gideon was moving, his rifle in hand. All traces of their conversation vanished. Sarah grabbed her own weapon and pressed herself against the canyon wall, every sense suddenly alert. A sound drifted to them on the night air, horses, multiple animals, moving with purpose. They were being followed. Gideon appeared beside her, his voice barely a whisper. 2 riders, maybe 3. They're not trying to hide their approach, which means either they're confident or stupid, or they want us to know they're there, Sarah suggested. That's what worries me. The riders came into view, or rather, their silhouettes did, backlit by moonlight. They stopped just outside rifle range, clearly visible, but not close enough for confrontation. One of them raised an arm in what might have been a wave or a salute. Then they turned and rode back the way they'd come, disappearing into the darkness. Message sent, Elias said grimly. They know where we are and where we're going. Webb's men? Sarah asked. Gideon nodded slowly. Most likely. Keeping tabs on us, making sure we know we're being watched. It's an intimidation tactic, meant to make us nervous, maybe convince us to turn back. Is it working? Juan asked. Hell no, Elias said. If anything, it tells me we're on the right track. They wouldn't bother following us if there wasn't something out here they don't want us to find. Sarah felt a mixture of fear and vindication. Fear because the threat was real and closing in. Vindication because her father was right. Webb was behind this. And now they had confirmation of sorts. But as she lay down to sleep that night, her rifle within arm's reach, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a trap with every mile they traveled. And the worst part was, they couldn't turn back now, even if they wanted to. Whatever waited for them in that canyon where Gideon had found the donkeys, whatever truth lay hidden in the desert, they were committed to finding it, no matter the cost. The second day's ride was harder. The terrain grew rougher, the sun more merciless, and the sense of being watched never left them. Twice, Gideon called for stops to check their back trail, finding nothing but feeling everything. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. They reached the canyon on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It was exactly as Gideon had described, a box canyon carved into rust-colored stone, its walls steep and unforgiving, its floor scattered with rocks and dried brush. A thin stream trickled through one side, barely enough to call water, but sufficient to keep the donkeys alive during their imprisonment. The makeshift corral was still there, crude but effective, poles jammed between rocks, rope weathered but intact. Gideon dismounted and moved through the space slowly, reading signs that Sarah couldn't see. They were here for at least 2 weeks, he said, kneeling beside a particular patch of disturbed earth. The donkeys, I mean. You can tell by the manure accumulation, the way they wore paths to the water. Whoever left them here checked on them at least once, maybe twice. Brought feed, kept them from dying too quickly. Why not just shoot them? Juan asked, the practical question of someone raised on the frontier. Because that would be evidence, Sarah said, understanding dawning. 14 dead donkeys with bullet holes would raise questions. But 14 animals that wandered off and died of thirst in the desert? That's just tragic misfortune. Exactly, Gideon agreed. Whoever planned this wanted the theft to look like the donkeys were taken by drifters or raiders, stolen for sale, driven off to parts unknown. When the animals never surfaced for sale, people would assume they'd been taken out of territory or killed. Either way, cold case. No trail to follow. Elias was examining the canyon walls, his expression troubled. But you found them. How? Gideon straightened, wiping dust from his hands. Luck mostly. I was tracking elk in the high country when I noticed ravens circling this area. Ravens mean death or dying. Came to investigate, found the donkeys. They were in bad shape, dehydrated, starving but alive. Took me 3 days to get them healthy enough to travel. 3 days, Sarah repeated. You stayed here with them for 3 days. Why? The question seemed to catch Gideon off guard. He looked at her, then away, toward the canyon walls. Because they needed help. What other reason would there be? But Sarah saw something in his expression, a vulnerability, a glimpse of the man he'd been before grief hollowed him out. He'd stayed because leaving meant abandoning creatures that depended on him, and he'd already abandoned too many responsibilities in his life. The donkeys had given him a chance at redemption, even if he didn't consciously recognize it. Juan had been examining the entrance to the canyon, and now called out, "Senor Gideon, you should see this." They gathered around what Juan had found, tracks, mostly obliterated by wind and time, but still visible to a trained eye. Boot prints, horse prints, the drag marks of something heavy being moved. 4 men, Gideon said, studying the pattern. Maybe 5. They brought the donkeys in, set up the corral, then left. But these prints here, he pointed to a separate set, these came later. Different boot, different horse. Someone checking on the animals after the initial drop-off. Elias knelt beside the tracks, his face grim. That's a custom boot. See the heel? That's expensive work, not something a common thief would wear. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Can we follow the tracks? See where they lead? Most are too degraded, Gideon said. But this set, the checker, not the original thieves, they lead back south. Generally toward Red Mesa. He paused, his jaw tightening. Toward Webb's land. They spent the next hour searching the canyon for additional evidence. Sarah found remnants of feed bags, cheap burlap that told them nothing useful. One discovered a campfire site, cold for weeks, but showing signs of multiple uses. And Elias, dear God, Elias breathed. Sarah turned to see her father standing near the far wall of the canyon, his face pale. In his hands, he held something that glinted in the afternoon sun. A brass compass, expensive and engraved. She rushed over, her heart hammering. Elias turned the compass so she could see the engraving on its case. M.W. Marcus Webb. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah found herself staring at the compass, her mind racing through implications. This was it. This was the evidence they needed. Direct connection between Webb and the canyon where the donkeys had been held. He was here, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. He came here to check on the donkeys, so make sure they were dying on schedule. Wait, Gideon said sharply. This is too convenient. What do you mean? Elias demanded. This proves Webb was involved. It proves someone with Webb's compass was here. That's not the same thing. Gideon took the compass, examining it with a skeptical eye. This is in too good condition. Brass tarnishes in the elements. This should show more weathering after weeks in an open canyon. Maybe it was protected, Sarah argued. Under a rock in someone's pocket. Where exactly did you find it? Elias pointed to a spot near the base of the canyon wall, partially buried in sand. There. It was just lying there like someone dropped it. Gideon's expression darkened. Or like someone placed it there recently. The implications settled over them like a weight. Sarah felt her certainty wavering. You think this is a plant? Someone wants us to find evidence against Webb? I think someone knew we'd come here, knew we'd search, and left us exactly what we expected to find. Gideon turned the compass over in his hands. The question is why? If Webb's guilty, why leave evidence? And if he's not, then someone's setting him up, Juan finished. Sarah's head was spinning. Nothing made sense anymore. If Webb was being framed, who was doing it and why? But if Webb was guilty, why would he be stupid enough to leave such damning evidence? There's another possibility, Elias said slowly. Webb's guilty, but someone on his crew is getting nervous. Maybe they want insurance, something to leverage if things go wrong. They plant the compass, knowing eventually someone will find it. That way, if Webb tries to throw them under the wagon, they can say he was personally involved. Gideon nodded thoughtfully. That's plausible. Honor among thieves only goes so far when jail time enters the equation. A sound from the canyon entrance froze them all, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. Sarah's hand went to her weapon, but a voice stopped her cold. I wouldn't do that, Miss Carter. Not unless you want your father's blood decorating these pretty rocks. 6 men emerged from positions Sarah hadn't even noticed, behind rocks, above on the canyon rim, places they must have occupied for hours waiting. Professional placement, military discipline. These weren't common ranch hands. The speaker was a tall man with a pockmarked face and cold eyes. He held a Winchester rifle pointed casually at Elias's chest. His companions had similar weapons aimed at each member of their party. Gideon Hale, the man said, his voice carrying an odd note of respect. Heard you were dead. I got better, Gideon replied, his hands held carefully away from his weapons. You going to tell me who's paying you, Morrison, or do we dance around it for a while? So Gideon knew him. Sarah filed that information away, her mind racing. The man, Morrison, smiled without humor. You know how it is. Client confidentiality and all that, he gestured with his rifle. Now you've found what you were meant to find. Compass, evidence, all very convenient. Time to head back and do what you're supposed to do. Which is? Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Why accuse Marcus Webb, of course. Take that compass to the sheriff. Make your case. Probably won't be enough to arrest him, but it'll be enough to ruin his reputation, tie him up in investigations for months. Morrison's smile widened. That's what you wanted, isn't it? Justice? Who hired you? Gideon demanded. Now, where would be the fun in telling you that? Morrison gestured again, more sharply. You've got your evidence. You'll ride back to Red Mesa, show it around, and let nature take its course. Simple. And if we don't? Elias asked. Morrison's expression went flat. Then your daughter dies first, while you watch. Then you. Then the young man. Gideon laughed, because I'm curious to see if the legendary ghost of the peaks dies, as well as he lived. He let that sink in. But it won't come to that, will it? Because you're reasonable people who understand when they're being given a gift. Sarah felt rage burning in her chest, hot and clean. They were being used. Someone had orchestrated this entire thing, the theft, the canyon, the compass, even their journey here. They were pawns in a game they didn't fully understand. Why go through all this? She asked. If you wanted Webb discredited, there are easier ways. Are there? Morrison's eyes glinted with dark amusement. Webb's careful. He's got the territorial governor in his pocket, half the territorial courts on his payroll. Direct action would just get people killed with nothing to show for it. But this is elegant. You find evidence, you present it. Even if it's not enough for conviction, it's enough to destroy his political capital. His friends start questioning him, his deals fall through, his empire starts to crumble. And all without anyone being able to trace it back to the actual architects. Coward's way, Gideon said flatly. Smart man's way, Morrison corrected. Now move, back to your horses. We'll be watching to make sure you head straight home. Any deviation, any attempt to warn Webb or involve the territorial marshals and people you care about start dying. Starting with that foreman of yours, Miguel. Nice man. Be a shame if his bunkhouse caught fire some night. The threat was clear and credible. Sarah looked at Gideon, saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he was measuring odds and finding them wanting. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of options. They mounted their horses in silence, the compass burning like an accusation in Elias's pocket. As they rode out of the canyon, Sarah looked back once to see Morrison and his men already disappearing back into the rocks, ghosts themselves, leaving no trace they'd ever been there. What do we do? She asked quietly once they were out of earshot. Gideon's face was carved from stone, his eyes distant. We do exactly what they don't expect. We figure out who's really behind this and we bring them all down. Morrison, Webb, whoever's pulling the strings. All of them. How? Juan asked. By remembering that the enemy of our enemy isn't necessarily our friend, Gideon said. And by asking ourselves who benefits most from Webb's destruction. Sarah thought about the land survey, the pressure on her father's ranch, the systematic dismantling of everything they'd built. Someone wanted Webb gone, yes. But they also wanted the Carters weakened, vulnerable, ripe for taking. This isn't about justice, she said, understanding crystallizing. This is about acquisition. Someone's trying to eliminate Webb and destroy us at the same time. Then they can sweep in and claim everything. Smart woman, Gideon said grimly. Now we just need to figure out who's smart enough, rich enough, and ruthless enough to orchestrate something like this. They rode toward home as the sun began its descent, 4 people carrying evidence that would likely start a war. But now they knew it was a war someone else had planned for them to fight. and the only way to survive was to change the rules entirely. Behind them, the canyon held its secrets close, and ahead of them Red Mesa waited, unaware that everything was about to change, that the careful game being played in the shadows was about to explode into the light. The brass compass weighed heavy in Elias's pocket, evidence and trap in equal measure. And Sarah found herself thinking about chess, about how the most important move was always the one your opponent didn't see coming. They'd been played, but the game wasn't over yet. They rode through the night, pushing the horses harder than was wise, but none of them could bear the thought of stopping. Morrison's men shadowed them for the first few hours, visible as darker shapes against the moonlit landscape, making sure they headed toward Red Mesa as instructed. Then, satisfied their pawns were moving as directed, the watchers vanished, but Gideon didn't relax. If anything, his vigilance increased. Sarah watched him constantly scan the horizon, his hand never far from his rifle, his body tense with the readiness of a man expecting violence. They stopped only once, briefly to water the horses at a spring Gideon knew. While the animals drank, Elias pulled the compass from his pocket and stared at it with a mixture of disgust and calculation. "I could throw this away," he said quietly. "Claim we never found it." "Walk away from this whole mess, could you?" Gideon asked. Elias was silent for a long moment. "No, because someone went to elaborate lengths to make sure we'd find this, which means they have a plan for what happens next. And if we don't play along, they've already shown they're willing to kill," Sarah finished. Morrison and his men weren't making idle threats. Juan had been quiet for most of the ride, but now he spoke up. "There's another problem. If we do what they want, accuse Webb with this evidence, we're helping whoever's really behind this. But if we don't, our families are in danger. We're trapped." "Not trapped," Gideon said, "just playing on someone else's board. What we need to do is change the game entirely." "How?" Sarah asked. Gideon knelt beside the spring, running water over his hands, in a gesture that seemed more ritual than necessity. "We tell the truth, all of it. We take the compass to Sheriff Morton. But we also tell him about Morrison, about being followed, about the setup. We lay out the whole thing and let him decide what to do with it. Morton's a good man," Elias said, "but he's not equipped to handle something this complex. Territorial politics, hired guns, elaborate schemes, that's beyond his jurisdiction and his resources. Then we go over his head. There are federal marshals in Santa Fe. They have the authority to investigate territorial corruption." "That could take weeks," Sarah protested. "Morrison said they're watching us. If we involve federal authorities, if we deviate from the script, they'll start killing people, yes." Gideon's voice was hard. "Which is why we need to move fast and careful. We get back to Red Mesa, we secure our people, and we bring in help before Morrison's employers realize we've gone off script." They reached the ranch as the sun was rising on the fourth day, exhausted and filthy, but alive. Miguel met them at the edge of the property, his relief at seeing them safe evident in his face. "Any trouble?" Elias asked. "Quiet," Miguel reported. "Too quiet. No sign of Webb, no visits from the land agent. It's like everyone's holding their breath, waiting for something." "They're waiting for us," Sarah said. "Waiting for us to fire the starting gun on whatever comes next." Inside the house, Sarah heated water for washing while the men gathered in Elias's office. She could hear the low murmur of their voices, the careful planning of men who knew they were walking a knife's edge. When she finally joined them, clean and dressed in fresh clothes, she found a map of the territory spread across the desk, with Gideon marking locations. "Morrison's men will be watching the main roads," he was saying, "and probably the telegraph office. We can't send messages without them knowing. But there are other ways to get word to Santa Fe." "The mail coach," Juan suggested. "Goes through twice a week. Too slow and too obvious," Gideon said. "No, we need someone they won't be watching. Someone who has legitimate reason to travel." "Brother Samuel," Sarah said suddenly. "He rides circuit, preaches at different communities. Takes him to Santa Fe once a month for supplies and to report to the Territorial Mission Board. He's due to leave in 2 days." Gideon nodded slowly. "That could work. If we can convince him to carry a message, if we can trust him to be discreet, He's a man of God, Elias said. But more importantly, he's a man of principle. If we explain the situation, show him the evidence, he'll help. And Morrison's people have no reason to suspect a traveling preacher. They spent the next hour drafting a letter to the federal marshal in Santa Fe, detailing everything. The theft, the canyon, the compass, Morrison's ambush, the larger conspiracy they suspected. It was a careful document, factual without being inflammatory, requesting investigation without demanding immediate action. Sarah watched her father's hand shake slightly as he signed his name. This letter, if it reached its destination, would set forces in motion that couldn't be stopped. It would expose corruption, certainly, but it would also paint targets on all their backs. Are we sure about this? Elias asked quietly. We're sure we can't do nothing, Gideon replied. Beyond that, we're operating on faith and stubbornness. A knock on the door interrupted them. Miguel entered, his expression troubled. Sheriff Morton is here, and he's brought Marcus Webb with him. The tension in the room ratcheted instantly. Sarah felt her hand move toward the pistol she'd taken to wearing since their return. But Gideon's slight headshake stopped her. They were committed now. Time to see how well they could act. Webb entered with his usual confidence, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Sheriff Morton followed, looking uncomfortable with the social call. Both men's eyes went immediately to the travel-stained clothes, the mud-caked boots, the obvious signs of a long journey. Mr. Carter, Webb said smoothly, I heard you took a trip into the back country. Productive, I hope? Productive enough, Elias replied carefully. Must have been important to take your daughter into such dangerous territory. I do hope nothing untoward occurred. The threat in the polite words was unmistakable. Webb knew where they'd been, probably knew what they'd found. But he was here fishing, trying to gauge their next move. Morton cleared his throat. Elias, Marcus came to me this morning with a concern. Says some of his personal property has gone missing. A compass, sentimental value. Last saw it about a week ago, now it's vanished from his office. Sarah's heart sank. Of course, Webb had reported the compass stolen before they could present it as evidence. Now anything they said would look like a clumsy attempt to frame him with his own reported property. Brilliant and ruthless, that's so. Gideon said, his voice neutral. Yes, Webb said, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. I'm sure it's just misplaced, but one can't be too careful. Valuables have a way of turning up in unexpected places, used for unexpected purposes. I thought I should report it properly, just in case. Good thinking, Morton said, oblivious to the subtext. I'll keep an eye out for it. After they left, Sarah slammed her fist on the desk. He's 3 steps ahead of us. He knew we'd find the compass, knew we'd try to use it, and he's already neutralized it as evidence. Which means he's in contact with Morrison, Gideon said. Or Morrison's in contact with him. Either way, the conspiracy runs deeper than we thought. So what do we do? Juan asked. The compass is useless now. We've got nothing concrete to take to the marshal. Gideon pulled out a weathered piece of paper from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. Sarah recognized it as the old wanted poster Miguel had mentioned, the one showing Gideon's face from years ago, when he'd been Deputy U.S. Marshal Gideon Hale. We do have something, Gideon said quietly. We have me. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I left the Marshal Service 15 years ago, but I never officially resigned. Just stopped showing up, stopped wearing the badge, let everyone assume I was dead or quit. But technically, my commission is still valid. Dormant, but valid. He looked at each of them in turn. If I reactivate my commission, I have the authority to investigate territorial crimes, to deputize civilians, to act with federal backing. That's a hell of a risk, Elias said. You'd be painting a target on yourself. The target's already there. Morrison recognized me, which means his employers know who I am, what I was. They're counting on me staying hidden, staying out of it. Gideon's jaw set with determination. Time to stop hiding. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This was the man Gideon had been before grief broke him. Decisive, purposeful, willing to stand in the gap between innocent people and those who would harm them. This was the man he could be again if he chose, "How do we reactivate your commission?" she asked. "Telegraph to the Federal Marshal's office in Santa Fe. They verify my identity, confirm my commission is still valid, and authorize me to act. Takes about 24 hours if we're lucky. And if Morrison's people are watching the telegraph office, then we make sure they're watching the wrong thing." Gideon smiled, and there was something dangerous in it. "We create a distraction." Over the next several hours, they planned with the careful precision of a military operation. Brother Samuel would carry the letter to Santa Fe as discussed, but that would be the decoy, something for Morrison's people to intercept if they were watching the preacher. Meanwhile, Juan would ride hard to the next town over, use their telegraph office to send Gideon's reactivation request. 2 messages, 2 routes, increasing their chances of at least one getting through. But they needed time, and time meant keeping Morrison's employers convinced they were still following the script, which meant they had to appear to be preparing to accuse Webb. "I hate this," Sarah said, as they finalized the plan. Using the truth as a lie, pretending to do what they want, while actually working against them. "Welcome to the world of law enforcement," Gideon said dryly. "Half the job is figuring out which lies serve the greater truth." That evening, Sarah found Gideon alone in the barn, checking on the donkeys. The animals crowded around him as always, seeking his touch, his presence. Samson, the big jack who'd first led them to the hidden gold, rested his massive head against Gideon's chest in a gesture of pure trust. "They love you," Sarah said softly. "They remember I helped them when they needed it." "That's not love. That's gratitude. Isn't that the same thing sometimes?" Gideon looked at her over Samson's ears. "What do you want, Sarah?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. What did she want? To save her ranch, certainly. To see justice done, absolutely. But standing here in the fading light, watching this complicated, damaged, heroic man gentle a donkey with scarred hands, she wanted something more. Something she didn't have words for yet. "I want you to survive this," she said finally. "Whatever happens, whoever's behind it all, I want you to live through it." "Is that selfish?" "It's human." Gideon's expression softened. "I'm not planning on dying, if that's what you're worried about. Plans and reality don't always align. You taught me that." "Sarah," he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "When this is over, when we've dealt with Morrison and Webb and whoever else is pulling strings, I'm not staying. You understand that, right? I'm going back to the mountains. It's where I belong. Is it?" Sarah challenged. "Or is it just where you've convinced yourself you deserve to be?" Before he could answer, Miguel burst into the barn, his face pale. "Come quick. It's Brother Samuel. Someone attacked him on the road. He's badly hurt," they ran. The preacher had been brought to the ranch house, his face bruised, his clothes torn, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage on his shoulder. But he was conscious, and in his eyes burned a fierce determination. "They took it," he said as Sarah cleaned his wounds. "Morrison's men stopped me on the road, beat me until I told them about the letter. Then they took it and left me for dead. But you're alive," Elias said. "That's what matters." "No." Brother Samuel grabbed Elias's arm with surprising strength. "What matters is that while they were focused on me, on that letter, young Juan got through. I saw him pass on the high trail while Morrison's men were searching me. He's halfway to Bolton by now with the real message." A slow smile spread across Gideon's face. "You played them. You sold the story, made them think they'd stopped our plan." "I'm a preacher, not a martyr," Brother Samuel said, wincing as Sarah tightened the bandage. "And I know a righteous cause when I see one. Those men, Morrison and whoever hired him, they're evil. Plain and simple. And evil has to be opposed, even when opposition costs us." "You might have just saved all our lives," Sarah said softly. "Then I'll add it to the good deeds column and hope it balances out my many sins." The preacher managed a weak smile. "Now someone get me some whiskey for this shoulder. The Lord may frown on drinking, but the Lord never took a bullet while protecting the innocent." That night, as Brother Samuel slept fitfully in the guest room, and guards were posted at every approach to the ranch, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She stood on the porch, looking out at the land her family had built, thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. Gideon appeared beside her, silent as always. For a long moment they simply stood together, two people on the edge of violence, waiting for dawn, and whatever it would bring. "I lied earlier," Gideon said finally. "When I said I wasn't planning to die," Sarah's heart clenched. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not afraid of death. Haven't been for 15 years. But tonight, looking at those donkeys, talking to you, seeing Brother Samuel bleed for doing the right thing," he paused. "Tonight I realized I'm afraid of dying before this is finished, before justice is served, before I know that you and your father are safe. That's not the same as wanting to live." "No," he agreed. "But it's a start." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the barely leashed violence that lived in those scarred fingers. "Then let's make sure you live long enough to figure out the difference. Tomorrow, Juan would reach Bolton. Tomorrow, the telegraph would sing with messages that would bring federal authority down on Red Mesa. Tomorrow, the careful web of conspiracy would start to unravel. But tonight, standing in the darkness with a man who was just beginning to remember why life mattered, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Not for easy victory, she knew better than that, but for the possibility that sometimes the good guys won. Sometimes justice prevailed. Sometimes broken people found their way back to wholeness. The donkeys stirred in their corral, sensing perhaps the weight of what was coming. And Sarah squeezed Gideon's hand once, a promise without words, before they both retreated inside to wait for dawn. Dawn arrived with deceptive peace. The sun rose over Red Mesa Ranch, painting the world in shades of gold and amber, giving no indication of the storm that was about to break. Sarah had slept perhaps 2 hours, fitful dreams of violence and loss chasing her through the darkness. Now she stood in the kitchen, heating coffee and trying to keep her hands from shaking. The return message from Santa Fe had arrived just before dawn. Carried by a rider, Juan had paid double to make the journey overnight. Sarah had watched Gideon read it by lamplight, had seen something shift in his expression, a settling of purpose, a squaring of shoulders that made him look younger and older at once. His commission was reactivated. Deputy U.S. Marshal Gideon Hale was officially back in service, with full authority to investigate territorial crimes and deputize civilians as needed. The federal marshal himself was en route with a team, expected to arrive within 3 days. Until then, Gideon was the law. "Here," Sarah said now, handing him a cup of coffee. He took it with a nod of thanks, and she noticed he was wearing the badge. Silver, tarnished from years of storage, but unmistakable. The sight of it made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride, certainly. Fear, absolutely. But also something like recognition, as if she were finally seeing the man complete rather than in fragments. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "Heavy," Gideon admitted. "Heavier than I remembered. That's because you know what it costs now. You didn't before." He looked at her, those grey eyes sharp with understanding. "You're too wise for your own good, you know that? Someone has to be, and you men seem determined to get yourselves killed through noble stupidity." The moment of lightness was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, many of them, moving fast. Miguel burst through the door, his rifle in hand. "Riders coming! 20, maybe more. Webb's leading them." "It's starting," Gideon said. He set down his coffee with careful precision and checked his weapons, rifle loaded, pistol clean, knife sharp. The ritual of a man preparing for violence. Then he pinned the badge to his chest, where everyone could see it, and walked outside. Sarah followed, her own rifle in hand, fear and determination warring in her chest. Elias emerged from the house behind them, pale but steady. Brother Samuel, his shoulder bandaged but his spirit unbroken, positioned himself on the porch. Miguel and the ranch hands spread out in defensive positions, their faces grim. Webb rode at the head of a small army, his own men mixed with what looked like hired guns, hard-faced men who wore violence like a second skin. But it was the figure beside Webb that made Sarah's blood run cold. Walter Griggs, the territorial land agent, rode with the confidence of someone who believed the law was on his side. And behind him, carrying what looked like official documents, was a territorial judge, corrupt or simply bought. Sarah couldn't tell. But his presence gave Webb's actions a veneer of legitimacy. They stopped at the property line, just close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. Webb's smile was triumphant, the expression of a man who believed he'd already won. "Mr. Carter," he called out, "I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news. Judge Morrison here has issued an injunction against your ranch, pending resolution of the boundary dispute. You're required to vacate the premises immediately." "Convenient timing," Gideon said, his voice carrying across the distance. "What with your compass turning up stolen and all?" Webb's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, Mr. U.S. Marshal Hale," Gideon said, and the words hit like a thunderclap. "And I'm afraid your injunction is going to have to wait. This property is now under federal investigation for crimes, including theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The effect was immediate. Webb's smile vanished. Griggs looked uncertain, his eyes darting between Webb and Gideon. The judge, Morrison, and Sarah felt sick at the name, leaned forward in his saddle, his expression hardening. "That's a serious accusation, Marshal," Judge Morrison said. "One that would require substantial evidence." "I have evidence," Gideon replied. "And more importantly, I have witnesses to an ambush in the territory. 6 armed men, led by a mercenary named Morrison." "Any relation to you, Judge?" The judge's face went carefully blank, but Sarah saw the flash of calculation in his eyes. This was who'd been pulling the strings, not just a corrupt judge, but the architect of the entire conspiracy. Brother and mastermind, using his brother's men to do the dirty work while he manipulated the legal system. "You're bluffing," Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Gideon pulled out a document, the reactivation of his commission, signed and sealed. "I have full authority here, Webb, and I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft. Judge Morrison, you're also under arrest for corruption and abuse of office. Anyone who interferes will be charged with obstruction of federal law enforcement." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tableau held, 2 sides facing each other across the ranch yard, the morning sun bright and harsh, exposing everything. Sarah could feel her heart hammering, could sense the violence coiled in every man present, waiting for the trigger that would unleash it. Webb's hand drifted toward his pistol. Around him, his hired guns shifted, reading his body language. On the porch, Miguel raised his rifle slightly, a motion matched by the other ranch hands. "Don't," Gideon said quietly, but his voice carried. "Webb, Judge Morrison, you're both intelligent men. You know how this ends if shooting starts. Some of you might survive, but most won't, and the ones who do will be hunted by federal marshals for killing a federal officer. There's no profit in that, no escape, just death and failure." "He's right," a voice said from among Webb's men. One of the hired guns urged his horse forward slightly. "I signed on for ranch work, maybe some intimidation. Not for shooting federal marshals. That's a hanging offense." "Stay where you are," Webb snarled, but the damage was done. Other men were exchanging glances, calculating odds, finding them wanting. The careful edifice of Webb's authority was cracking, exposing the fear and self-interest beneath. "Last chance," Gideon said. "Surrender peacefully, cooperate with the investigation, and maybe you see the inside of a prison instead of a noose. Fight, and I guarantee you won't live to see a trial." Sarah watched it happen in Webb's eyes. The moment calculation overtook pride. The instant survival instinct conquered arrogance. His hand moved away from his pistol, rising slowly in the air. "I want a lawyer," he said flatly. "You'll get one," Gideon replied. "Judge Morrison?" The judge's face was stone, but he too raised his hands. "This is outrageous. I'll have your commission revoked before sundown." "Maybe, but you'll do it from a cell." Gideon gestured to Miguel and the ranch hands. "Disarm them. Anyone resists, shoot them." The next few minutes were tense chaos. Weapons collected, hands tied, men separated and secured. Some of Webb's hired guns tried to run, spurring their horses toward the open desert. Gideon let them go, reasoning that scared men fleeing were less dangerous than trapped men fighting. When it was over, Webb and Judge Morrison sat on the ground, bound and furious, surrounded by a handful of their most loyal men. The rest had surrendered or fled, the army reduced to a fraction of its original size. Sarah felt her legs go weak with relief. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. No bloodshed, no deaths, just the cold application of law and the collapse of a conspiracy exposed. But then she saw Gideon's expression, saw him staring toward the eastern horizon with sudden tension. She followed his gaze and felt her relief turn to ice. More riders were coming. But these weren't Webb's men. These were Morrison's mercenaries, the ones from the canyon. And they were coming fast, guns drawn, with the clear intention of finishing what Webb had failed to start. Get to cover, Gideon shouted. The real fight, Sarah realized with sinking dread, was just beginning. The mercenaries hit the ranch like a thunderstorm. 6 men spread out in a tactical formation, using the terrain for cover, firing with the precision of experienced soldiers. Bullets splintered wood, kicked up dust, forced everyone to dive for protection. Sarah found herself behind a water trough with her father, both of them returning fire toward shapes that moved too fast and too smart. These weren't cowboys or ranch hands. These were men who'd fought in wars, who knew how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Gideon had taken position near the barn, his rifle speaking in measured rhythm. Sarah watched him work and saw the 15 years fall away. This was Deputy Marshal Hale, the man who'd been legendary for his tactical awareness and deadly accuracy. Every shot he took was considered, purposeful, never wasted. They're trying to flank us, Miguel shouted from his position by the bunkhouse. Sure enough, 2 mercenaries were working their way around the left side, using the corral for cover, but they'd forgotten about the donkeys. Samson, the big jack who'd led them to the hidden gold, let out a bray that sounded like a war cry. Then he charged, 1,400 pounds of angry donkey bearing down on the mercenaries with startling speed. The other donkeys followed, a stampede of braying, kicking fury that scattered the flanking attempt into chaos. One mercenary went down under Samson's hooves, screaming. The other scrambled backward, firing wildly, hitting nothing but air. The donkeys didn't stop, pressing their advantage with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Did those animals just, Elias started, staring in disbelief, save our lives? Yes, Sarah finished, feeling a hysterical laugh bubble up. They were being rescued by donkeys. If they survived this, nobody would ever believe it. Morrison himself appeared then, stepping out from behind the barn with a rifle leveled at Gideon's back. Sarah's heart stopped. She couldn't get a clear shot, couldn't warn him in time. The rope appeared from nowhere, looping around Morrison's rifle and yanking it upward just as he fired. The shot went wild, and Morrison spun to find himself facing Brother Samuel, who, despite his wounded shoulder, had managed to lasso the mercenary leader like a calf at a rodeo. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," Brother Samuel said pleasantly. "But the Lord sometimes needs help with the particulars." Morrison went for his pistol, but Gideon was already moving. He covered the distance in heartbeats, his hand locking around Morrison's wrist with enough force to make the mercenary cry out. The pistol fell, and then Morrison was on the ground, Gideon's knee on his chest, the marshal's badge inches from his face. "You made 2 mistakes, Gideon said, his voice cold and hard. "First, you thought I was still the broken man who ran to the mountains. Second, you threatened people I care about. Both were fatal errors in judgment. This isn't over," Morrison gasped. "Judge Morrison has connections. Judge Morrison is under arrest and about to lose everything," Gideon interrupted. "And you're going to tell me exactly who else is involved in this conspiracy, or I'll make sure you face every territorial and federal charge I can think of. How long do you think you'll last in prison, Morrison? How many people have you hurt over the years who'd love 5 minutes alone with you?" Morrison's bravado crumbled. "There's others. Bigger players. The judge isn't the top of this thing." A shot rang out, and Morrison's words ended in a gurgle of blood. Sarah screamed, searching for the shooter. "There, On the roof of the barn, one of the mercenaries had somehow gotten into position. But even as she raised her rifle, the man was falling, hit by Juan's perfectly placed shot from the bunkhouse window. Morrison died in the dust, his secrets dying with him. Gideon stood slowly, his face carved from stone, and surveyed the battlefield. 2 mercenaries were dead. 3 had surrendered, and 1 had fled on horseback toward the desert. The donkeys had returned to their corral, somehow unharmed despite the chaos, watching the humans with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah's ears rang from gunfire. Her hands shook from adrenaline, but they were alive. They'd survived. Sheriff Morton appeared then, riding hard with a dozen deputized townsmen. He took in the scene, the bodies, the bound prisoners, the bullet-scarred ranch, and his face went pale. "Dear God," he breathed. "What happened here?" "Justice," Gideon said flatly. He gestured to Judge Morrison, who was trying to appear innocent despite being bound hand and foot. "Your judge is corrupt. He and his brother orchestrated the theft of the Carter donkeys as part of a larger scheme to seize territory land. Morrison's mercenaries just tried to eliminate witnesses. We have multiple counts of conspiracy, attempted murder, and corruption of office." Morton looked like a man whose world had just tilted sideways. "Judge Morrison?" "But he's been on the bench for 10 years. 10 years of taking bribes and manipulating cases," Webb said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. The rancher's face was bitter, broken. "I worked with him at first, yes. Paid him to rule in my favor on land disputes. But then he got greedy, started making demands. When I tried to pull out, he threatened me, set up the donkey theft to frame me if I didn't cooperate. The compass, he had his men plant it to ensure I stayed in line." "You're saying you're a victim?" Sarah asked incredulously. "I'm saying I'm a fool who got in bed with a snake and got bitten." Webb met her eyes. "I'm guilty of plenty, Miss Carter. Bribery, intimidation, schemes to buy up land cheap. But the theft, the violence, that was the Morrison brothers. I just got caught in their web like everyone else. It had the ring of truth, or at least partial truth." Sarah looked at Gideon, saw him weighing Webb's words, calculating. "You'll testify to all of this?" Gideon asked. "Every detail. Names, dates, payments. I'll give you everything, if it means bringing down the Morrison family. They've run this territory like their personal fiefdom for too long." The sound of more horses interrupted them. "But these weren't mercenaries or corrupt officials. These were federal marshals, a full team led by a grizzled man in his 60s who took one look at the scene and let out a low whistle. "Hale," he said, dismounting. "When they told me you were reactivating, I didn't believe it. Thought you were dead or drunk or both. But it looks like the ghost of the peaks still has some life in him." "Marshal Garrett," Gideon replied, shaking the man's hand. "Good timing. Your message said you needed federal intervention for a conspiracy case. Looks like you weren't exaggerating." Garrett surveyed the prisoners, the bodies, the destruction. "We'll take custody of all prisoners, start formal proceedings. You did good work here, Gideon. Real good work." Sarah watched Gideon's face carefully. There was satisfaction there, yes, but also exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd remembered what it cost to stand in the gap, to be the shield between innocents and those who'd harmed them. Marshal Garrett and his team spent the next hour securing prisoners and taking statements. Webb was separated from Judge Morrison, both men now in federal custody, facing years of investigation and trial. The surviving mercenaries were hauled away in chains, their brief moment of violence ending in capture and certain punishment. As the sun climbed toward noon, Sarah found Gideon standing near the corral, staring at the donkeys who'd somehow turned the tide of battle with their unexpected intervention. Samson stood at the fence, his massive head tilted as if asking for acknowledgement. "They saved us," Sarah said softly. "They saved themselves," Gideon corrected. "Fought for their home, their safety." "Can't fault them for that. Is that what you're doing? Fighting for a home?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he unpinned the badge from his chest and held it in his palm, studying it like an artifact from another life. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he admitted. 15 years I've been running from this, from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of failing people again. Thought the mountains were where I belonged. But standing here, fighting alongside your father, protecting you," he paused. "It felt right in a way nothing has felt right since Mary and Thomas died." Sarah took his hand, badge and all. "Then maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to come home." "This isn't my home." "It could be," Sarah said, "if you let it. If you're brave enough to try." Before Gideon could respond, Elias called out, waving them toward the house. Marshal Garrett needed final statements, needed details for the federal case. The work of justice was far from over, but as they walked together toward the house, Sarah holding Gideon's hand, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that broken people could heal. Hope that second chances were real. Hope that love could grow even in the harsh soil of loss and grief. Behind them, 14 donkeys watched with knowing eyes, as if they'd understood all along what the humans were only beginning to learn, that loyalty, once earned, could move mountains, or at least save a ranch. 3 weeks later, Red Mesa Ranch had found its rhythm again. The bullet holes had been patched, the bloodstains scrubbed away, the physical evidence of violence erased. But the people who'd lived through those terrible hours carried the memory in ways both visible and hidden. Elias moved a little slower now, favoring his back after diving for cover too many times. But there was also a lightness to him that hadn't been there before. The burden of impending financial ruin lifted by the territorial government's compensation for damages and the return of stolen property. The ranch was secure, the debts paid, the future no longer quite so uncertain. Brother Samuel wore his wounded shoulder like a badge of honor, telling anyone who'd listen about the day he roped a murderer while quoting scripture. His congregation had doubled in size, people drawn to a man of God who proved he was willing to bleed for his principles. Juan had been offered a job with the Territorial Marshal Service, his quick thinking and steady aim during the battle catching the attention of Marshal Garrett. He'd accepted, planning to leave after the harvest, eager for adventure but sad to go. Miguel had already started training his replacement, though both men knew Juan was irreplaceable in the ways that mattered most. And Sarah had discovered something about herself in those desperate moments of violence. She was stronger than she'd known, braver than she'd believed, capable of standing firm when the world tried to break her. The revelation had changed her, added steel to her compassion, made her someone who would never again doubt her own courage. But the most profound changes were in Gideon Hale. He'd stayed, though everyone expected him to vanish back into the mountains once the federal marshals finished taking statements. He'd kept the badge, accepting a permanent position as territorial marshal for the Red Mesa district. And he'd moved into the small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to be part of the community, far enough to maintain the solitude he still sometimes needed. Sarah found him there on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the battle. He was working on the cabin's porch, replacing boards damaged by weather and neglect, the 14 donkeys grazing nearby in a pasture Elias had set aside specifically for them. They were never far from Gideon, their loyalty absolute and eternal. "Looks good," Sarah said, settling onto a finished section of the porch. "It's coming along." Gideon set down his hammer and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Might actually be livable by winter. You planning to stay that long?" It was a question she'd been afraid to ask, afraid of the answer. But they'd faced death together, had stood shoulder to shoulder against men who meant them harm. If she couldn't be brave enough to ask about the future, then what had all that courage been for? Gideon sat beside her, his shoulder brushing hers in a gesture that felt both casual and significant. "I received a letter from Marshal Garrett yesterday. The Morrison case is solid. Both brothers are going to prison for the rest of their lives. Webb's testimony sealed it. He'll serve time too, but probably only 5 years given his cooperation. That's not an answer to my question." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, opening it to show the faded photograph of Mary and Thomas. I've been carrying this for 15 years, looking at their faces every day, using their memory like a hair shirt, punishing myself for the crime of surviving when they didn't." Sarah's throat tightened. "And now?" "And now I think," his voice caught, "I think they'd be ashamed of what I became, of how I wasted the life they would have given anything to keep. Mary used to say that the best way to honor the dead was to live well, to find joy, to serve others, to make the world a little better than we found it. Instead, I hid, I ran. I chose death in slow motion instead of having the courage to keep living." "Gideon, let me finish," he said gently. "These past few weeks, working alongside your father, seeing you stand up to evil, watching Brother Samuel bleed for righteousness, it reminded me that being alive means more than just breathing. It means standing for something, fighting for people who can't fight for themselves, building instead of just surviving." He turned to look at her directly. "It means accepting that love isn't a betrayal of those we've lost. It's the only way to honor them properly." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to stay. Not in the cabin alone, not in the mountains hiding. I want to be part of this community, this ranch, this—" he gestured between them. "Whatever this is becoming between us. If you'll have me. If it's not too late, too late." Sarah laughed through her tears. "Gideon Hale, I've been waiting for you to figure this out since the moment 14 donkeys walked onto my ranch following a ghost who didn't know he was looking for home." He kissed her then, gentle and questioning, a man who'd forgotten how to hope, learning how to trust again. Sarah kissed him back, tasting salt and sunshine and the promise of second chances. When they pulled apart, Samson was standing at the porch steps, watching them with what Sarah could have sworn was approval. The big donkey brayed once, loud and triumphant, and the other 13 answered in chorus, a celebration in the only language they knew. "I think they approve," Gideon said, smiling in a way Sarah had never seen before, unguarded, genuinely happy. "They should. This was their doing as much as ours." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "They brought you back to us, brought you home." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern both comfortable and new. Gideon took his martial duties seriously but not obsessively, learning to balance law work with ranch work, with community, with the careful building of a life he'd thought lost forever. He taught Juan tracking skills before the young man left for his new position. He helped Elias plan the next season's crops. He joined Brother Samuel's congregation, sitting in the back pew, but present nonetheless, and he courted Sarah with the careful attention of a man who knew the value of what he'd been given. Long walks in the evening, conversations that stretched into the night, the slow building of trust and understanding that formed the foundation of something deeper than passion, partnership. 6 months later, on a spring morning, when the desert bloomed with wildflowers and the air smelled of rain and possibility, Gideon Hale and Sarah Carter were married in the small church in Red Mesa. Brother Samuel performed the ceremony, his wounded shoulder healed but still stiff, his voice strong with conviction as he spoke about love, conquering death, and hope outlasting grief. Elias gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face. Miguel served as Gideon's best man, the older Mexican rancher who'd seen something in the mountain man from the beginning. And 14 donkeys stood in a semicircle outside the church, witnesses to a miracle they'd helped create. In his vows, Gideon spoke of Mary and Thomas, honoring their memory while embracing his future, acknowledging that loving Sarah didn't diminish what he'd felt for his first family, but rather honored it by proving he could still open his heart despite the pain. Sarah wept openly, as did most of the congregation, moved by a man's journey from grief to hope, from isolation to community, from death to life. The celebration lasted late into the evening, the whole town turning out to mark the occasion. Dutch Henderson provided whiskey from his saloon's private stock. The Miller family brought enough food to feed an army. Children ran wild between the adults, their laughter the sound of a community at peace, as the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of copper and gold. Gideon found himself standing at the edge of the celebration with Sarah's hand in his. looking out at the land that had become his home. The mountains still called to him sometimes, their distant peaks reminding him of years spent in solitude. But the call was gentler now, invitation rather than compulsion, memory rather than exile. "Regrets?" Sarah asked quietly. "None," Gideon said, and meant it. "Well, maybe one. What's that?" "That it took 14 stubborn donkeys to teach me what I should have known all along, that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, with people you love, one day at a time, until suddenly you realize you're exactly where you're meant to be." Sarah squeezed his hand. Pretty wise for a man who spent 15 years talking to trees. The trees were excellent listeners, but they weren't nearly as good at kissing. They laughed together, that shared sound of joy that comes from surviving darkness and choosing light. Behind them, the celebration continued. Before them, the land stretched vast and beautiful, full of promise and possibility. And in their pasture, 14 donkeys grazed peacefully, their work complete, their loyalty vindicated, content in the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the world worked the way it should. That good people found each other, that evil was punished, that love conquered grief, and that a single act of compassion could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. The people of Red Mesa would tell the story for generations. How 14 donkeys surrounded a mountain man at the ranch. And what happened next changed everything. They'd embellish it, certainly, adding details that may or may not have been true. But the heart of the story would remain constant. That loyalty matters, that second chances are real, and that home is always waiting for those brave enough to claim it. As Gideon Hale and Sarah Carter walked back toward their celebration, toward their future, toward the life they would build together, the donkeys watched with knowing eyes. Then Samson, the big jack who'd started it all, brayed once more, not in alarm or need, but in simple, profound satisfaction. The sound echoed across Red Mesa Ranch, across the desert, up into the mountains where a ghost had once hidden from life. But there were no more ghosts here, only people learning to live again. Only love triumphing over loss. Only home at last, for a man who'd forgotten what the word meant. And that, as Brother Samuel would say in his sermons for years to come, was miracle enough.